The galaxy stood at the edge of an uneasy peace. For decades, the scars of the Great War had healed, and humanity's influence seemed to wane in the galactic theatre. Star systems once governed by human hands were now overseen by indifferent councils and rival species. Yet, in the silent corners of space, something ancient stirred. A beacon long buried, a forgotten cry for help. Captain Alira Rhodes leaned over her console, her fingers hovering over the controls. The ship, Aegis Horizon, drifted through the dead zone, a place where signals rarely reached, and nothing of significance ever happened. Or so she thought. Her eyes narrowed as a peculiar pattern emerged on her screen. A faint signal, too structured to be random, cut through the static, reaching out like a whisper from the void. "Can you trace it?" she asked, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. The crew had long dismissed the dead zone as a void that only swallowed the curious. But this was different. The Horizon's communications officer, Lieutenant Escher, worked quickly. "It's a distress signal. I'm getting a human signature, but the source is scrambled. It's old, decades, maybe centuries out of date. There's no registry for it in the archives." His fingers danced across the panels, recalculating coordinates, trying to lock onto something real. "It's from the human colony at Vega Station. The last known report from there was over 70 years ago." Alira's breath caught in her throat. Vega Station. A place most in the fleet thought was lost forever. No one spoke about it anymore. The colony had been one of the first to pioneer human expansion beyond the Sol system, but after a mysterious disappearance, all records were erased, and the name itself was forgotten. "Set a course," Alira ordered, her voice firm. Despite the cold silence of the dead zone, a small spark of hope ignited within her. This wasn't just an old transmission. This was a call for something, or someone. The Aegis Horizon shifted direction, its engines humming softly as they made their way to Vega Station. But as the ship cruised through the quiet expanse, Alira couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The closer they drew, the more the crew sensed it. The once quiet station loomed on the edge of their radar, a hollowed-out shell drifting among the stars. What remained of Vega Station was barely visible through the thickening cloud of debris and radiation. Something had happened here, something that had wiped it clean off the maps. As the Horizon docked with the derelict station, Alira gave the order to deploy a search party. She gathered a small group of her most trusted officers. Lieutenant Taran Juno, a weapons expert with a no-nonsense attitude, and Dr. Caven Veller, a historian who specialized in pre-war human technologies. They made their way into the heart of the station, which seemed frozen in time, its dimly lit corridors filled with dust and abandoned equipment. Every step they took echoed through the vast emptiness. At the central hub, a console flickered weakly to life. As Dr. Veller approached, his face pale with disbelief, he read the data displayed on the screen. "It's a record," he muttered, "of human soldiers. But these files, they are not just military records." His voice trailed off, realization sinking in. The records belonged to the Vanguard, humanity's once elite force, whose existence had been erased from history itself. Why were they erased? Taran asked, his voice low, suspicion creeping into his tone. Alira looked down at the blinking screen, her heart pounding. "We need to find out." Before they could move further, a heavy metallic thud rang out from somewhere deeper in the station. The hairs on the back of Alira's neck stood up. Something, or someone, was still here. The Vanguard had not been forgotten by just history. Something had kept them hidden for a reason, and now that reason was waking up. The hum of the Aegis horizon was deafening in the otherwise still, abandoned corridors of Vega Station. Elira's heart raced as she motioned for her team to move forward. Dr. Veller, now visibly shaken, scanned the console with urgency, his fingers typing in rapid succession, as though unlocking something that had been sealed away for centuries. The screens flickered again, revealing encrypted military data, a record of operations, assignments, and the identities of soldiers. What exactly are we looking at here? Lieutenant Taran Juno asked, glancing over his shoulder as he held his weapon tight. His eyes darted to the shadows, alert to every sound. The station felt alive with tension, but no one could say why. "It's the Vanguard," Velar muttered, barely believing his own words. "The ones who disappeared after the Great War. Elite soldiers, trained to defend humanity from any threat. They were meant to be humanity's ultimate weapon, but they vanished. All records of them were erased, as if they never existed." Elira's mind raced. She had heard the stories, whispers of the Vanguard, of a group of soldiers who were too powerful, too dangerous, and too essential. They had been humanity's best-kept secret. But now they were more than stories. They were a forgotten legacy, and they were waiting to be uncovered. "Where are they?" Taran demanded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the screen. "Where are the soldiers?" Veller paused for a moment before his voice dropped. "According to this, they're in stasis. They'd been kept here, on this station, preserved. In cryo-chambers, hidden beneath layers of security." Cryo-chambers. Elira whispered to herself, her mind racing. The Vanguard were here, alive, or at least alive enough to be frozen, and they were waiting for someone to come. "What do we do now?" Taran asked, his voice steady but filled with underlying anticipation. Elira didn't hesitate. "We wake them up." With Veller's guidance, the team navigated deeper into the station, past the control rooms and into a secured section buried far beneath the station's surface. The walls were lined with darkened doors, each one sealed with a set of complex biometric locks and strange, unfamiliar runes. But Veller knew the codes, had studied human military technology for years. As the last door slid open with a sharp hiss, they found themselves staring at the frozen forms of the Vanguard soldiers. Dozens of stasis pods, each one housing a warrior who could change the fate of humanity. The soldiers lay within, their bodies perfectly preserved, the technology that had kept them alive a marvel from the time before the Great War. "Do we have a chance of waking them all?" Taran asked, his voice low, unsure whether this was a blessing or a curse. Elira stepped forward, eyeing the central pod where Commander Elias Targan was held. His broad shoulders, scarred face, and battle-worn uniform spoke of a man who had seen endless war. He was the leader of the Vanguard and the key to unlocking their potential. "We start with him," Elira said, her voice unwavering. As Veller activated the awakening sequence, the pods hummed to life. A low, resonant sound filled the air as the cryogenic chambers began to thaw. The Vanguard were waking up, one by one, their eyes flickering open, their bodies slowly coming back to life. Commander Targan's eyes snapped open first. His breath was shallow, ragged. His body tensed, as if returning from a battlefield. His gaze landed on Elira, who stood before him, her face a mixture of awe and determination. He blinked twice, adjusting to the light and reality around him. "It's been a long time," Targan rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper. "How long has it been?" 100 years, Elira replied, her voice tight. "We need you. The galaxy needs you." The commander's expression hardened. "Then you've come to the right place. But I warn you, No one escapes the past unscathed. Before Allura could respond, the sound of a loud explosion rattled the station, shaking the walls. The deep, metallic groan of Vega Station reverberated through the air. Allura's heart skipped a beat as alarms began to blare across the speakers. Targan looked up sharply. "Looks like we don't have time to catch up. Someone's already on to us." The Vanguard had awoken, but their return had not gone unnoticed. A storm was coming, and it was far darker than they could have imagined. "We're not alone," Targan muttered. "Prepare yourselves. The fight is only just beginning." The station trembled once more, and this time the roar of distant engines reverberated through the metal walls, signaling the approach of something massive. The power systems of Vega Station sputtered to life, casting eerie flickers of light along the darkened hallways. Allura's heart raced as she glanced at the newly awakened Vanguard soldiers, their eyes scanning the surroundings as they adjusted to their unfamiliar reality. Commander Elias Targan, his battle-hardened body stiff from centuries of stasis, was already on his feet, his posture exuding quiet authority. His cold, calculating gaze fell upon Allura, then the rest of the team. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the echoing sirens. "Allura," Targan spoke, his voice a mix of gravel and steel. "I assume you didn't come here just to wake us up." Allura nodded, her jaw tight. "We need your help. The galaxy, humanity, is at risk again. The war, it never really ended, and now a new threat is rising." Targan's eyes narrowed. He had heard of the dark whispers among the fringe systems, rumors of powerful enemies stirring in the void. The Vanguard had been created to handle this very thing, threats that the rest of humanity couldn't even begin to comprehend. But as he stood in the wreckage of a forgotten station, something gnawed at him. How could we have been so wrong? He turned to the rest of his soldiers, now slowly rising from their pods, shaking off the disorientation of their long sleep. Their eyes were sharper, their bodies reacting instinctively to the old training, silent and deadly. "We'll need to get to the control room," Targan said, his voice commanding. "Whoever is coming isn't just here for a casual visit. They've already breached our defenses." Lieutenant Juno, ever the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. "You don't know what we're dealing with. The threat might be something new, something beyond what you trained for." Targan's gaze hardened as he made his way to the door. "Nothing is beyond the Vanguard." Allura swallowed her doubt. Whatever this new threat was, they had no choice but to trust in the soldiers they had just awakened. She signaled the team to follow, and they moved through the corridors, their boots echoing with the sound of impending battle. As they neared the control room, the faint glow of the station's emergency lights revealed a long hallway lined with heavy metal doors. Allura glanced at Targan. The Vanguard were in their element now, their presence a reminder of what humanity had once stood for. But beneath the steel facade of the commander, Allura saw a flicker of something else, something darker, more uncertain. He noticed her gaze. "You're wondering why we were left here, why humanity forgot about us." She nodded but didn't speak. Instead, she quickened her pace. "Because we were a weapon," Targan continued, his voice low. "Not a shield, but a sword. And when the war ended, humanity chose peace. It chose to forget the price of that peace. They hid us away so that they could pretend that the galaxy was safe. They were wrong." His words hung in the air like the chill of the dead station around them. When they reached the control room, the door opened with a loud hiss, revealing a panel of blinking lights and monitors, most of them malfunctioning or fried. The center screen flickered to life, showing a grainy image of a warship, massive, heavily armored, and advancing straight toward them. "That's not a standard fleet," Lieutenant Juno observed, his voice grim. "Whoever they are, they're not from any of the known factions. And they've got weapons on board that can punch through any defense." Targon's lips twisted into a thin smile, one that carried years of experience and countless battles fought. "Then we'll give them a fight they never saw coming." Elira looked at the Vanguard soldiers, each one now fully awake, their faces set with purpose. They were more than just soldiers. They were humanity's forgotten legacy, and they were ready to reclaim their place in the galaxy. As the warship neared, a countdown began to appear on the screen. The station was preparing to receive them, or to die trying. Elira's pulse quickened. "Prepare yourselves," Targon commanded, his voice cold and steady. The Vanguard rise again. The station was about to become ground zero in a war humanity had long ago forgotten, and the Vanguard were its first and last line of defense. The ship on the screen was nearly upon them, its hulking form blotting out the stars as it loomed in the distance. The countdown continued, its relentless beeping echoing in the otherwise silent control room. Elira's heart hammered in her chest as she stood beside Commander Targon, watching the Vanguard soldiers fall into their old rhythm. They had barely spoken since the revelation that a new war was upon them, but their movements spoke volumes. Targon's gaze never left the screen. His face was a mask of focused determination, though there was something almost haunted in his eyes. He wasn't just commanding a fight, he was revisiting a nightmare. The scars of the past were deep, and though he had buried them for a century, they were returning now with a vengeance. "We can't fight this alone," Taran Juno said, his voice taut. "The ship's weapons are too advanced for our old systems. We'll be wiped out before we get close." "We don't need their firepower," Targon replied coldly, his voice as sharp as a blade. "We need to be smarter. I didn't survive the war by charging headfirst into a fight. We'll outthink them." Elira's thoughts raced. What kind of threat could this massive warship represent? What enemy could possibly have access to technology capable of breaching the defenses of a station designed to withstand some of the deadliest threats in the galaxy? "Do we know who they are?" she asked, turning to Velar, who had been monitoring the incoming vessel's scans. Velar was frantically typing into his console, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No match," he muttered. "This ship is unlike anything we've encountered. The hull is reinforced with a material that it doesn't register in any of our databases." "Great," Taran muttered. "We're fighting ghosts." Elira's mind flashed back to their earlier conversations, of the Vanguard, their missions, their purpose. The soldiers had been kept hidden, but there were more secrets here. Secrets that would determine whether they could stand a chance against whatever was coming. "Time's almost up," Velar said, his voice tight. "They're within range." Targon turned toward his soldiers. "Ready yourselves. We have one shot at this." Each Vanguard soldier responded immediately, their bodies going into a combat stance, their eyes locking with Targon's. There was no hesitation. They'd have fought together countless times in the past, and now they were preparing for what could be their final battle. "We're going to send a signal," Targon said, his voice calm but firm. "A distress signal to every nearby system. We won't be able to rely on Vega Station's defenses, but we can buy ourselves time until reinforcements arrive." Velar hesitated. "You think the fleet will answer?" Targon's expression didn't falter. "If the Vanguard still mean anything to humanity, they'll answer. They always do." As the countdown ticked closer to zero, the team moved with precision. Velar worked furiously at the console, connecting the ship's comm system to the signal relay. Taran checked his weapon, ensuring that his plasma rifle was fully charged. The Vanguard soldiers stood ready, each one silent but deadly. And Alira's mind was a whirl of doubts and questions. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back. The ship's warship was nearly upon them now. They could hear the rumbling of its engines vibrating through the station's walls. The time for hesitation had passed. Targan stepped toward the control panel, his voice steady as he issued orders. Activate the relay. Full power. Velar's fingers flew across the console, and within moments the signal was sent, blasting into the void at the speed of light, a cry for help that would either bring salvation or lead to their doom. Targan turned to Alira. We fight now. And as the enemy ship loomed closer, the Vanguard did what they had always done best. They prepared for war. The stakes had never been higher, and for the first time in over a century, the Vanguard were no longer the forgotten soldiers of a bygone age. They were humanity's last hope, and they would fight with every ounce of their being to defend it. The control room was bathed in an eerie blue light as the massive enemy ship drifted into full view. Its surface was unlike anything the Vanguard had ever seen, smooth, like liquid metal, with no visible weapons or markings. It was as though the ship had been built for stealth, designed to deceive anyone who might try to identify it. But its intent was clear. It wasn't here for peace. Brace yourselves, Targan said, his voice steady but urgent. They're about to make their move. Alira's grip tightened around the edge of the console, her eyes fixed on the enemy ship as it edged closer to the station. The countdown was over, but the threat was just beginning. There was no escape now. Velar's hands flew across the station's terminal, activating every defensive measure still available. We've got shields up, but they won't last long against that ship's firepower. We need a miracle. Taran stood by the door, his eyes scanning the flickering screens that filled the control room. Miracles don't win wars, he said, loading his weapon. But we can give them one hell of a fight. The enemy ship fired first. A brilliant blue beam of energy erupted from its forward cannon, slamming into Vega Station's already weakened shields. The station's hull groaned under the impact, and a series of alarms blared across the room. The force of the blast sent the group stumbling, but they quickly regained their footing, shields down to 20%. Velar shouted, his fingers racing to adjust the power distribution. We won't last long at this rate. Targan's face remained cold, calculating. We can't fight this ship head-on, not with the station's defenses failing. He turned to his soldiers. We need to board their ship. We take the fight to them. Alira's breath caught in her throat. Board their ship? How are we supposed to? Disrupt their systems? Targan interrupted, locking eyes with her. Once we're inside, we cripple their weapons. If we can disable their main reactor, we can take them down. His words carried an air of grim determination, but even Targan couldn't hide the underlying tension in his expression. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a war against a force the Vanguard had never encountered before. Juno, Targan said, turning to the lieutenant. You and Velar will handle the tech. Disable their defenses. Alira, you're with me. Without waiting for further instructions, the Vanguard soldiers moved into position, each one executing the orders with practiced precision. Targan was already at the station's weapons locker, securing his gear. The rest of the team followed suit, equipping themselves with advanced weapons designed for close-quarters combat and sabotage. Make sure you stay in contact, Targan called as he slid his helmet into place. His voice filtered through the comms. If we lose communication, we lose the fight. Velar quickly set up a relay station, connecting it to the enemy ship's transmission network. His hands were steady as he hacked into their systems. bypassing layers of security with frightening ease. It was clear that he was no stranger to these kinds of operations. Still, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. This was a different kind of enemy, one that seemed to anticipate every move they made. Disrupting their internal communications now, Velar muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Their shields are temporarily offline. You have 10 minutes before they regain full control. Targon didn't need to hear more. He motioned for Alyra to follow, and they moved swiftly toward the nearest airlock. It was time to leave the station behind and board the enemy vessel. As the airlock sealed behind them, Targon's voice was calm but firm. "Stay focused. We've trained for this. This is what we were made for." The countdown on the station's console continued to tick, the sound of the enemy ship's weapons charging reverberating through the hull. They had no time to waste. The Vanguard were humanity's last line of defense, and they would fight until the very end. With one final glance at the station's fading control room, Alyra stepped forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever horrors the enemy ship had in store. The fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. The airlock door hissed open, and Alyra's boots thudded against the cold metal floor of the enemy ship. The stench of ozone and burning circuitry filled the air, and the faint hum of alien machinery reverberated through the walls. The ship was eerily silent, its dark corridors stretching ahead like the veins of some monstrous creature. Alyra's pulse quickened as she took in the alien environment, and she couldn't help but feel like they were intruders in a place that wasn't meant for human feet. Targon moved first, his steps purposeful, his eyes scanning every shadowed corner as he led the way through the narrow hallway. His rifle was gripped tightly in his hands, and the rest of the Vanguard soldiers followed in tight formation, weapons ready. There was no room for error here. The slightest mistake could lead to their demise. "Velar, any updates?" Targon's voice came through the comms, calm but insistent. "Internal systems are still compromised," Velar replied. "I've disabled their shields and some of their internal defenses, but their main reactor is still online. You've got a short window before they regain control." The ship's dim lighting flickered as the group moved forward. Alyra kept her senses heightened, every step bringing them closer to their goal. The deeper they went into the ship, the more alien it felt, its walls smooth and unyielding, with strange symbols and markings etched into every surface. The architecture seemed to shift and pulse, as though the ship itself were alive. "We're close," Targon muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay sharp." Alyra's heart pounded in her chest. The ship was vast, and though the walls were quiet, the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on her. Every instinct screamed that they were walking into a trap. But there was no turning back now. They were humanity's last hope. They reached a large door, its surface covered with a strange metallic sheen that seemed to ripple as Targon approached. It wasn't locked. The ship was letting them in. Targon signaled for them to hold their positions. He knelt by the door, pulling out a small device from his belt, a sensor array designed to detect any traps or hidden systems. His fingers moved quickly over the interface, the device beeping in response. "All clear," he muttered. "But be ready for anything." With a swift motion, Targon activated the door. It slid open, revealing a vast chamber beyond, a central hub, illuminated by eerie, pulsating lights. In the center of the room stood what could only be described as the heart of the ship. A massive core, thrumming with power, surrounded by strange machinery and cables that seemed to grow out of the walls themselves. This was it, the main reactor. "We disable this. We take them down," Targon said, his voice low but resolute. Alira moved toward the core with Targon and the rest of the Vanguard in tow. As they neared the heart of the ship, a chilling realization struck her. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was alive, or at least it felt that way. The walls seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the reactor, the air growing thick with an unnatural energy. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the lights overhead flickered, casting the room in unsettling shadows. Alira's heart skipped a beat as she whipped around to face the door. It wasn't just the ship's systems locking them in. Figures moved from the shadows, tall, sleek, and encased in dark, flowing armor. They were humanoid, but their faces were obscured by helmets that gleamed like polished obsidian. Their weapons were drawn, glowing with an eerie light. Targon's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel to it. "Stay in formation. We've got company." The enemy soldiers advanced, their movements synchronized, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Alira's hand instinctively reached for her sidearm, but before she could draw it, the first of the armored figures struck. The air buzzed with energy as a pulse of deadly light flashed across the room, narrowly missing Targon. The Vanguard immediately reacted, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Taryn fired first, his plasma rifle tearing through the air as it struck one of the armored figures, sending it crashing to the ground. But the others didn't hesitate. They countered with brutal efficiency, their weapons cutting through the Vanguard's defenses. "We need to finish this fast," Taryn yelled, firing again. But the enemy soldiers were relentless, moving with inhuman speed and precision. They were too many, and the Vanguard were too few. Alira's pulse raced as she fired her sidearm, the weapon's energy bolts cutting through the air. Her shots found their mark, but the armored figures seemed to shrug off the hits, their shields absorbing the impact. "We have to reach the reactor," Targon shouted. "Move." With the enemy closing in from all sides, the Vanguard fought with everything they had. But Alira knew that time was running out. They couldn't keep fighting like this forever. They had to disable the reactor, or humanity's last chance would slip through their fingers. The room was chaos. The sound of plasma fire filled the air as Alira ducked behind a piece of machinery, her chest heaving with each labored breath. The enemy soldiers, whoever they were relentless. Their movements were like a deadly dance, fast and precise, anticipating every one of the Vanguard's attacks. Their armored bodies absorbed the energy blasts with unnerving efficiency, and their weapons returned fire with devastating power. Alira peeked from behind the cover, catching a glimpse of Targon battling one of the armored figures, their weapons locked in a brutal clash of sparks and energy. Taryn and the others were engaged in their own skirmishes, but their progress toward the reactor was slow. The enemy seemed to be herding them, pushing them farther into the room, closing off any escape routes. "We need to get to the core now." Targon shouted over the comms, his voice sharp with urgency. "Alira, Taryn, clear the path." Alira's heart pounded as she fired another round at one of the enemies, but the shot ricocheted off their shield. They were too strong, too well-equipped. But the core, it was their only chance. They had to reach it. A sudden realization struck her. The core wasn't just a power source. It was a weapon in itself, likely the center of the ship's control systems. Disabling it could cripple their entire fleet, but it was heavily guarded. If they didn't act quickly, they would be wiped out before they could even reach it. "Veller." Alira called through her comms, hoping he was still monitoring the battle. "Can you override the core's defenses remotely?" "I've been trying." Veller's voice crackled through the static. "The ship's internal systems are like a maze. I can't break through their main firewall without more time." Alira clenched her jaw. Time was something they didn't have. The enemy soldiers were closing in again, their weapons trained on her and Taryn. They couldn't keep this up. "Damn it, Veller, we don't have time," Taryn yelled, firing another barrage at the advancing enemies. "Give us something. Anything." There was a pause, and then Veller's voice came through, tinged with frustration. "I can try a direct override on their reactor. If I can access their central power grid, I can destabilize it. But you'll need to buy me time." "Do it," Targan ordered. "We'll hold them off." Alira and Taryn exchanged a quick glance. They didn't need words to understand what had to happen next. They were going to have to fight their way to the core while Veller worked his magic. Targan moved first, taking point and charging forward. The Vanguard fell into position, their backs to the walls of the reactor room, the remaining enemy soldiers closing in. Alira's breath quickened as she sprinted after Targan, her weapon raised, ready to fire. The enemy soldiers were relentless, but Alira had no intention of backing down. She fired in quick, controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. One of the armored figures collapsed, but there were still too many to count. She couldn't focus on their numbers, though. Her eyes were locked on the reactor. Taryn was at her side, covering her as she dashed for a lower platform leading directly to the core. The ship groaned beneath them, its metallic walls vibrating under the constant barrage of weapon fire. "We're close," Alira shouted, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. "We just need a few more minutes." But the enemy wasn't relenting. One of the armored figures lunged at her, their blade flashing in the dim light. Alira barely dodged, the edge of the blade grazing her arm. She gritted her teeth, the sting of pain fueling her resolve. She couldn't stop now. With a quick motion, Alira slammed her weapon against the soldier's chest, sending a shockwave of energy through their armor. The soldier staggered back, allowing her to push forward. Taryn was right behind her, laying down cover fire as they approached the reactor core. "Almost there," Taryn shouted. Alira's fingers flew over the control panel, accessing the interface that Veller had guided them to. The reactor was massive, a complex system of glowing conduits and cables. She had no idea how to operate it, but Veller's voice crackled through her earpiece, offering rapid-fire instructions. "Disconnect the secondary relay," Veller barked. "That will initiate the destabilization sequence. It won't shut it down entirely, but it'll make them vulnerable. We'll need to get out of here in less than 5 minutes." Alira's hands were shaking, but she worked with urgency, following Veller's guidance as quickly as she could. The relay flickered to life, and with a final press of a button, the system hummed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the reactor emitted a deep, low growl, followed by a sharp, violent pulse of energy. The ship shook violently. "Get out of there," Targan yelled. "Now." Alira barely had time to react. The walls of the reactor room buckled as the power grid destabilized, and a bright, blinding light began to pulse from the core. "We've got to move now," Taryn screamed, grabbing Alira's arm as the entire room shook. The ship groaned, its once imposing hull now trembling with every pulse of unstable energy emanating from the reactor. Alira's heart pounded as she was yanked forward, Taryn's grip tight on her arm. The floor beneath them buckled, and the entire room seemed to cave in on itself as the reactor destabilized. A deep, thunderous rumble vibrated through the walls, and sparks rained down from above. "We need to get to the exit," Targan shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He was already sprinting toward the hallway, the rest of the Vanguard soldiers falling into formation behind him. "Move! Move! Move!" Alira barely registered the violent shockwave that passed over her. The blast of heat seared her skin, and she stumbled, almost losing her footing. She could hear the screams of the enemy soldiers behind them, but there was no time to fight anymore. No time for hesitation. They had done what they came to do, and now survival was the only priority. "Come on!" Taryn shouted again, dragging Alira along as they followed the others down the corridor. The once sleek, pristine walls of the ship now felt like a death trap, twisted and buckling under the pressure of the reactor's impending collapse. The floor buckled beneath their feet, and the very air they breathed felt dense with the energy surging through the failing system. Alira's breath was ragged, her mind focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other. She couldn't afford to think about anything else. Not the pain in her side from the earlier wound, not the constant tremors that rattled the ship, not the enemies still hot on their heels, desperate to stop them from escaping. All that mattered was reaching the exit. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting as the ship's structure began to tear itself apart. The walls flickered with strange, alien symbols, their lights sparking out as they ran. Alira's pulse quickened when she saw the blast doors up ahead. They were the final barrier between the Vanguard and the outside, the final obstacle before they could escape the ship and take their mission's success with them. But they were far from safe. A violent explosion behind them rattled the ship once more, and Alira heard the unmistakable sound of enemy soldiers closing in. They were coming, faster than expected, intent on preventing their escape. There was no time to hesitate. Targan was the first to reach the blast doors, and without hesitation, he slammed his palm against the control panel. The door flickered to life, but it only opened a few inches. A series of sparks shot from the panel, and the door screeched in protest. "Damn it," Targan growled. "It's jammed." Alira turned, her breath coming in short gasps, and saw the enemy closing in. They were too close. They were running out of time. "We have to force it open," Alira shouted. "I'll cover you," Taryn said, stepping up to her side. He raised his rifle, aiming at the approaching soldiers. "Go." Alira didn't waste any time. She crouched down by the control panel, trying to override the system manually. Sparks flew as her fingers danced across the interface, her mind racing to figure out a solution. The enemy was getting closer. She could feel their presence, the weight of their weapons ready to strike. "You've got to hurry," Taryn called out. The first enemy soldier lunged forward, and the crack of plasma fire rang through the hallway. Alira's fingers shook, but she didn't stop. She had to get this door open. She had to. With a sudden, desperate effort, she yanked a large lever on the panel, and the door gave a violent jerk. It opened wide enough for one person to slip through. "Taryn, go," she yelled, pushing him forward. "Get to the ship. I'll hold them off." Taryn hesitated for a split second, but then nodded, turning and bolting for the ship's escape hatch. Alira heard him shout something, but the words were lost in the roar of battle that erupted around them. The door was still partially open, and the enemy soldiers surged forward, eager to finish what they had started. But Alira wasn't going to let them. She drew her sidearm and fired, hitting one soldier square in the chest, sending them crashing backward. "Come on," she shouted again, her voice hoarse with adrenaline and fear. She knew she couldn't hold them off for long. Targan and the others were already through the door. They were waiting for her. She could hear their voices urging her to hurry. The enemy was almost on her. She fired again. Another shot. Another soldier down. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could last. Her arm ached. Her breath was shallow. The walls were collapsing, and the air was thick with the heat of the exploding reactor. Elira dove through the barely open blast door, her body slamming into the cold, hard surface of the escape ship. She barely had time to roll over and scramble to her feet before the doors slammed shut behind her. The roar of the ship's engines fired up, and they shot away from the enemy vessel, escaping the devastation. The moment the ship pulled away, Elira sank into her seat, her hands trembling. She glanced around at her fellow soldiers, their faces tired, but the weight of their success was clear. They had done it. The forgotten Vanguard had risen, and they had changed the course of humanity's future. As the ship blasted through the stars, the doomed alien vessel behind them erupted in a brilliant explosion, the light blinding as it disintegrated into nothingness. They had won. For now. But the war was far from over.